Welcome, everyone. It's really it's so wonderful to see so many people and a lot of familiar names and some faces. So I'm Jocelyn Alcott. I'm a professor of history and international comparative studies, and I currently serve as the director of the program in gender, sexuality, and feminist studies here at Duke University. Before I turn things over to Rika Pratis to introduce the participants in today's workshop, I just want to say, first of all, how thrilled we are to have this event. It really is, Rika's really the intellectual author of today's event, but she's been part of a 2-year program. She's been in the second year of a postdoc where we've been thinking about economies of care. And an animating question behind our larger research project has centered on how we describe the boundaries of communities of care and ways we might reimagine social practices that establish and sometimes police those boundaries. Queer studies and queer theory have, over the past few decades, particularly pressed the question of how we understand our communities and the kinship structures that undergird them, yielding challenging but generative ideas about what a more careful society would look like. It's difficult to imagine a more exciting lineup of people to talk about these issues than the group that Rika has gathered today. Today's event forms part of an ongoing international interdisciplinary collaboration on revaluing care in the global economy, which we launched a couple of years ago. Pedro was like a founding part of that conversation, so it's him here today. We focus on 3 principal research areas. First, metrics, so how we measure care, how it affects care when we try to measure it. Second, evidence, how laws and policies both foster and reflect normative values of care. And third, social practices, so how various practices and social formations inform attention to care. We've also started from 2 fundamental premises that have become even more evident in the current moment. First, that social, cultural, and ecological care are all interdependent and imbricate. And secondly, that innovative solutions to the so-called crisis of care can be found in many corners of the world, particularly those that have been most suspicious of market and technology-based solutions. If you're interested in learning more about the research network and our projects, please put your email address in the chat and we'll add you to our mailing list. We're planning a diverse schedule of programming centered on how to foster an economy in the service of care and sustainability rather than the service of efficiency and growth. In particular interest, perhaps for today's audience, next Friday, we'll kick off the Visualizing Care series with an event on queering communities of care, which will feature a conversation with the artists Devin Emery and Gabriel Garcia Roman, with our colleagues Pedro Lash and Pete Siegel. There will be an accompanying online exhibit of these 2 artists as well as several others, offering various artistic renderings of care. And that series, the Visualizing Care series, will also continue through next week. This summer, in the end of June and beginning of July, June 30th and July 1st, we'll have a 2-day workshop as part of a collaboration with the University of Exeter's Wellcome Center on the Cultures and Environment, which will explore a cluster of themes, including this question of communities of care, also on aging and cities, and anyway, there's 5 topics if you're interested. The workshop will be entirely online and very informal. We're welcoming all interested participants, and it will include researchers from both Duke and Exeter, but a number of other institutions, as well as artists, activists, and practitioners. The Revaluing Care in the Global Economy project, including today's event, has enjoyed broad support at Duke, particularly from the Office of Global Affairs. And for this workshop, we particularly want to thank the Mellon-funded Humanities Unbounded program and the program in Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies. So without further ado, let me turn things over to Rika Pratis, who will introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Thanks, Shelly, for that introduction. I'm still busy here and letting people in because we have so many attendants, which is nice, but maybe Pedro or Amanda, you can take over for now. Thank you. First I would like to, so my name is Rika Pratis, as you already heard, and I work as a postdoc here at the Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies program at Duke. I'm very excited about this event, as you can probably tell, and I'm also so grateful for speakers that you all accepted our invitation so generously. And I'm super excited that we have so many of you in the audience today. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge that this event is taking place on Turtle Island, where many of us are based, in the settler colonial context of the United States. The United States are built on genocide and the stealing of First Nations lands. They are also built on the stealing of bodies and the death of Black people. I want to emphasize that both trajectories, so the continued occupation of land and the continued killing of Black and brown folks, are ongoing. I'm speaking from Durham today, which is the land of the Ino, Okanagan, and Saponi people. And as an uninvited visitor on these lands, I pay my respect to Ino, Okanagan, and Saponi elders, past, present, and emerging. And I would like to extend this respect to all First Nations people in the audience today. Given the focus of our discussion today, which is on kinship and care, I would like to especially underline the care that I have received during these past months of the pandemic from this land, from country. Care that country can give because it has been cared for by First Nations people for millennia. So a few words in housekeeping. After our introductions, our three speakers will respond to pre-circulated questions for about 10 to 15 minutes each. And after that, we will have Q&A with you, the audience. Please indicate in the chat box that you have a question and we will call on you in turn. We prefer this way, even though it's a large crowd, that people ask their own question because I feel so much is lost by restating other people's questions. But if you prefer not to speak, and there are many reasons why people cannot speak their own questions, please write your question in the chat box and we will, like with a little note, and we can read it for you. Yes, so now I'm super great. It's my great pleasure to hand it over to my co-host, Associate Professor Pedro Augusto Gravata Nicoli, who I asked to give a short comment before we kick off with the speakers. Professor Nicoli is based at the Faculty of Law at the Federal University of Minas Gerais in Brazil, where he's also coordinator of Diverso UFMG, the leading nucleus of sexual and gender diversity, which develops research in labor law, social law, and human rights, especially around topics such as informality and labor margins, gender, sexuality, and precarity. He's also a member of the Rebellion Care and the Global Economy Network and a dear friend of mine. So please, Pedro, take it away.
Thank you, Rika, for this wonderful introduction. And of course, for all the hard work of putting together this incredible panel. You're just amazing, and I really love you. Also, a big thank you to Jolie and all GSF members for making this and so many other things possible. I really miss you all. Hi, everyone. I'm Pedro. It's really nice to meet you. I hope everyone is safe and healthy, and thank you for joining us this morning. So in the next 5 minutes or so, I'll try to make a very fast introduction to our session. And I'll start with a sensation that in a way we learned from one of our speakers, Shelly Park, a sensation that we often need to drop queer or to leave queer behind when we're dealing with certain topics. With care and kinship, it seems to be often the case. Even though there's growing debate, one cannot help but feel that care scholarship is still very heterosexual and cis. And there's also the sensation that care is not a particularly queer topic, at least not in the way we're induced to think of care. But we can sure do things differently. And the work of our amazing panelists, to whom I thank, is doing exactly that. All of them, in a way or another, help us seeing that the idea of a place of care, being that place the body, the family, community, or public spaces, is strongly hetero and cis-centered. So they propose, in a way, a decentering of all that. This is key for queer lives, of course, but also for defining what care is. A few words on that, on the definition of care. There seems to be no news when one says that the dynamics of care is marked by gender, race, sexuality, and coloniality. Some are deprived of it, some have loads of it. But there's something more than that. I feel there's a tendency in care analysis of acknowledging those structural conditions without bringing them to the heart of the debate. Whatever care is and whatever kinship is not usually to be defined by that. And here is why this conceptual dispute is so important. If we really want to see care as what produces life and sustains it, we need to go further on the question, what goes really into it? We need to go with geographer Parvati Raghuram. We need to ensure that care is not defined by those who have been privileged enough to receive care. This is what the work of our panelists is actually doing to the subject, redefining care and kinship. This redefinition will lead us to see that a lot goes on a care web, to use Hugh Maletino's words: family, love, friends, social security, health insurance, job protection, but also a lot of different practices as well that are not stable, are not neat, are not necessarily precise or equal, and they are strongly affected by queerness. The concept of circuits of care by Nadia Guimarães from the University of São Paulo seems quite helpful here. For her, a circuit of care is defined by the interaction of subjects, meanings, types of social relationships, and forms of retribution. Nadia identifies two very well-documented circuits of care care as a profession and care as an obligation, in which these elements are sort of more clearly defined. But there's a third circuit, one that she sees as the broad help circuit, with a set of activities that are not socially read necessarily as care. In her and Priscila Vieira's work in the poor peripheries of São Paulo, they will show how communal care is being performed by women in a very different way from mainstream care, a process of mutual aid, of ajuda, in which the boundaries between work, exchanges, and reciprocity are very fluid. Something that resonates Martin Manalansan redefinition of the chain of care. Martin talks about, and I quote, a series of conflicting and diverse bonds between labor, emotions, corporeality that do not line up neatly in terms of gender binaries and normative familial arrangements. So queer, in the end, will put care in motion. And this motion is actually the point of this panel. Quickly, one last element of this framing. So as Rika mentioned, in Belo Horizonte, Brazil, where I am one of the coordinators of a legal clinic on LGBT rights called Diverso in our university. We work in really many different fronts, such as legal counseling for low-income LGBT people, and we're just now starting a research and outreach project on LGBT aging in our city. Belo Horizonte is the third largest metropolitan area in Brazil with almost 6 million people. So this new project called Longe Viver, something like long living, is built around the idea of queering elderly care and the right to LGBT aging. So as soon as the pandemic allows, and of course the situation in Brazil is particularly awful right now with our tragic president, we'll start our empirical work in several spaces. But one particular space promises to be quite challenging for our field work. We're going to be on what we call the long permanence care institutions. All of those institutions in our city have, some of them have public financing and are directed to low-income populations. And all of them have a strong religious presence, either of Catholic Church or neo-Pentecostal churches. So the idea there is to investigate how dissident gender and sexuality expressions are dealt with in a care facility. From our preliminary findings, we learned some very difficult things. The possibilities of queerness, of course, are often denied in spaces like this. Deprivation of the expression of your gender and sexuality at the late stages of your life might be the price you have to pay to access basically basic elderly care. There are even reports of trans people being slowly forced to detransition in those spaces. So, but at the same time, on the other hand, the project also shows that care demands for the elderly are definitely not on your typical LGBT agenda. So here, an in-between sort of open up. For a project like this, and I think also for the lived life, I think kinship, queer, and care need to be thought together. This is an essential move. All right, so enough of me. I'll hand it back over to Rika so she can properly present our speakers and we can finally listen to them. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Pedro, and I love you too very much. So I'm going to introduce our speakers before I hand it over to them. So it's my very great pleasure to introduce Martin F. Manalansan IV, who is the Beverly and Richard Fink Professor in Liberal Arts and Associate Professor and Director of Graduate Studies in the Department of American Studies at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. Professor Manalansan is the author of Global Divas, Filipino Gay Men in the Diaspora. He's co-editor and editor of several anthologies, such as Filipino Studies, Cultural Compass, Ethnographic Explorations of Asian America, Queer Globalization, Citizenship in the Afterlife of Colonialism, and Eating Asian America, a Food Studies reader. He's published widely in journals from GLQ to Cultural Anthropology and edited numerous special issues. And I'm going to apologize that all of these introductions are going to be very brief, but I'm sure that you all would love to hear more from the speakers themselves rather than me talking about them. So one last thing about Professor Manalansan, his current book project includes the ethical and embodied dimensions of the lived and lives and struggles of undocumented queer immigrants, Asian American immigrant culinary cultures, the effective dimensions of Filipino migrant labor and Filipino return migration. And I want to also mention that before coming back to academia, he worked for 10 years in HIV research, program evaluation, and prevention education in New York City. Shelly Park is professor of philosophy and cultural studies at the University of Central Florida in Orlando, Florida. She wishes to acknowledge that her work takes place on the homelands of the Timucua, Seminole, and Tocobaga peoples. Her work centers on queer kinship, intimacies, and care. Professor Park's book, Mothering Queerly, Queering Motherhood, explores mothering in a variety of two-mother families created through adoption, divorce, and remarriage, lesbian partnerships, and polygamous unions. While continuing to work on issues of queer kinship, her current work focuses on technologically mediated intimacies and care, and is especially interested in how and why technologies of care are racialized and gendered. She's working on a monograph tentatively entitled Helicopter Mothers in Smart Homes, the Deployment of White Femininity as a Surveillance Device. And last, but certainly not least, we have Maletino, who's Assistant Professor of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies and Philosophy at Penn State. Professor Maletino is the author of Trans Care, an excellent book that came out last year with Minnesota Press. And his first book is Queer Embodiment, Monstrosity, Medical Violence, and Intersex Experience. Professor Maletino's essays have appeared in Hypatia, TSQ, Angelaki, Rhizomes, and elsewhere. And currently he's working on a book about being trans and feeling bad, which I'm very much looking forward to reading. So maybe to just give you a very short framing of the sort of questions that we asked, so how we framed the responses that you will hear. So the overarching frame, of course, is queer kinship. And so we asked what queer kinship means in each of our speakers' work and how it's connected to care. Specifically, we asked them to talk about what can be learned about care when decentering its dominant cis heteronormative and white framing, to talk about colonial and racial dimensions as they interact with queerness and care, and also to respond to individualization of care and caring and moves that aim at collectivizing care and or open up communities of care to be messy, multi-locational, and promiscuous. So those were sort of our prompts, and now I'm super excited to hear what they have to share with us. We're going to start with Gil. Please, the screen is yours.
All right, so this is a little bit of a dangerous proposition for me because I've just finished my second cup of coffee and I don't normally talk until that's done, and it just happened. So bear with me if I'm a little slow cognitively. Before I start, I just want to briefly acknowledge that I am speaking to you from a little village outside of State College, Pennsylvania called Pine Grove Mills. It's the ancestral land of the Susquehannock peoples. And I've been saying in the context of land acknowledgements lately, I've been pointing to the fact that Penn State is the second largest land grant institution in the country. So their wealth is predicated upon territories that were handed to them, that were expropriated in over 16 states that were the territories of, I think, over 112 tribes. So I think that's imperative to mention, just to locate where I'm at, and also to situate the economic wealth of the institution that I'm at, which people tend to associate with football. It's not just football, of course, it never is. Okay, so I'll just hop into this, and as a little bit of a refresher, the first question was on what it is to decenter care practices away from the white hetero cis-normative home. So I'll start with some comments on that. And I just want to say that the germ of the book of Trans Care was basically the summer school that I taught with Aaron Azura, who's at the University of Minnesota, Minneapolis currently. And it was on queer and trans affective labor specifically. And we were really keen to think in this like summer school intensive course about, in some ways, and I mean, I think for me coming from a philosophy background, we were thinking about the ways in which feminist care ethics has really failed to dignify queer and trans lives and experiences historically. And I was very preoccupied in that moment with sort of going back to some of the canonical readings in care ethics and thinking through both what they had to offer to thinking specifically about trans experience, but also some of the real critical limitations. So that was where I was coming from in this project initially. And Aaron had been writing about what he calls the communization of care and actually using a ton of drawing heavily upon Manalansan's work. So I'm very, very excited to be in this panel with Martin Manalansan and also with Shelly Park, who I saw present work on queer parenting about a decade ago at the Feminist Ethics and Social Theory Conference. I forget where, I think it was in like somewhere outside of Chicago that year. And it was the first time I had seen Shelly present work, and it totally blew my mind and recalibrated how I thought about the possibilities of kinship. So I'm really excited to be here. But anyway, back to the germ of the book. So Art and I taught this summer intensive that attempted to move from the sort of phenomenological experiences of trans efforts to build kin networks, trans efforts to care for one another. So it was really grounded in what I think of as like infrapolitical care work within trans communities. And that was where the book began. And for some of you that have read the book, and I know it's certainly not all of you, but for those of you who've read it, you can probably see how that nexus is really, really at the core of the book. So I was moved to think about, and this is drawing from Elizabeth Pavanelli's work, to think about care as not centered on the family, but instead care is directly, or what would care look like if it circulated amongst and was thought primarily as having to do with the care that is exchanged amongst folks with whom we're socially consubstantial. So not about degrees of intimacy and knownness, and certainly not about love, which is often mistakenly taken as the sort of like core nexus of care and care work. And I also thought a bit about, although I did not write about it in the book, about how so often love is used as a form of like emotional blackmail with trans folks in relationship to their biofamilies. So I was very keen to rend apart care from love and also from questions of intimacy and proximity in terms of one's domestic relations, erotic relationships, etc. Which is not to say that care doesn't circulate there, it certainly does, but I was more interested in thinking about how care circulates elsewhere. And with certain degrees of anonymity, actually, which led me to think about trans counterpublics and how digitally mediated trans counterpublics are, right? So often I think trans folks are really relying on the emotional labor of folks that they only know tangentially in person, if in person at all. And it's been the case, I think this has been the case for, I want to say forever, even though I don't want to make a trans historical claim, but a lot of the archival work I've been doing over the last few years looks at the circulation of like trans community newsletters from the 70s through the 90s and then into sort of the internet age. And these were so integral to trans communal formation and forms of emotional labor that circulated amongst trans subjects because folks were closeted, stealth, really widely geographically dispersed unless they happened to have the privilege of living in a major metropolitan area. And even then, the intimacies between and amongst trans subjects tended to be heavily dispersed. So anonymity and the sort of like lack of embodied knowingness that is really imperative in trans communities because people don't always know one another, aren't always in embodied connection with each other, became important for the work of decentering conversations about care for me. And I'm moving through bullet points really quickly. So in the Q&A, if any of these points seem underdeveloped, I'm happy to answer more questions about them. I'm just trying to move fast through them. The last thing I want to mention has to do with the coercive recruitment of care work. And I'm thinking about this specifically in regards to what Rupert Raj, this trans activist who's been doing really, really integral work for the last, I think, 4 decades in trans communities, calls voluntary gender labor. And voluntary gender labor, I understand, is just sort of a synonym for unremunerated or poorly remunerated care labor engaged by trans folks. And something I see over and over again in researching trans histories is the way that the medical establishment has really intensively recruited in very exploitative ways care work from trans subjects and used the lure of the romance of trans community to do so. So I'm thinking specifically about how nonprofit organizations would have like trans therapy groups and also just groups, you know, trans consultation groups where trans folks could come meet with therapists and doctors that were willing to give them the letters they needed to access medical services. But the folks who ran those groups were often multiply marginalized trans folks, and usually, or often, in at least in major metropolitan areas, trans women of color. And they were recruited into this unremunerated labor basically by the promise of being able to sit in a room with other trans people safely and talk about their experiences with one another. And that was all an attaché to sort of funneling folks into the medical apparatus. And it's not to say that this is wholly bad, but I do think that it is I do think that there are exploitative dimensions to the way that this recruitment of trans care labor operates in relationship to the medical industry, and it's really important to note that. And that's also part of why I think in my work I've taken a more infra-political turn and started to think about the forms of care labor that trans folks offer to one another outside of the nonprofit apparatus and outside of the medical apparatus. So that's sort of where my thinking is headed. And on that note, there's actually a special issue of TSQ that Cam Awkward-Rich and I are currently in the midst of editing on T for T, or trans for trans, forms of intimacy, care, erotics, etc. That's sort of an extension of that line of thought. So I'll stop there with the first question. The second question had to do with the colonial and racial dimensions of queer and trans care. So I have been for a long time really deeply informed by Lugonis's articulation of the modern colonial gender system, and specifically what she's called the light and the dark sides of the colonial modern gender system. And I've thought a lot about transnormativity in relationship to the light side of the modern colonial gender system. So the lure of transnormativity is really, I think, fundamentally about the lure of bourgeois whiteness and the ability to approximate normative bourgeois white familial mores, sexual mores, etc. So I think that's where I'd want to begin thinking through, at least in relationship to my own work, the colonial and racial dimensions of trans care. And I also think it's really important once one names transnormativity in relationship to the colonial modern gender system to begin to think about the limitations of that lore, especially for white trans subjects, obviously, who are the ones that are most sort of readily hailed by and assimilated into operative forms of transnormativity. So some of what I've been writing about is really about dissecting the logic of that lure and how really strongly appealing it is, but also the ways in which that lure always fails to deliver what it promises for trans subjects. And the second bit I wanted to mention has to do with racial legacies of care in relationship to trans medicine. So lots of folks have written about this, but the history of trans medicine is obviously a history of racialized gatekeeping. And that racialized gatekeeping persists into the present in really sort of hydra-headed and multivalent ways. And I think one of the things I've been outraged about recently, one of the manifestations of this that I've been outraged about recently, has to do with the venture capital backed transition coaching and hormone subscription services that are really specifically targeting multiply marginalized and poor trans subjects without insurance or with trans exclusions in their insurance. And this is, for me, just an extension of this legacy of making transition economically inaccessible, in some ways radically unaffordable for folks without insurance, with trans exclusionary insurance. And these venture capital backed projects are really just forms of predatory racial capitalism dressed in the sort of garb of trans inclusion and trans affirmation, and it makes me very, very mad. So that's something I wanted to mention, and hopefully we can talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A, because I know a lot of other folks are similarly outraged about this recent development. And also the fact that these companies have proliferated in the context of the pandemic is something that is important to mention and intensifies my outrage about it. So also the racial politics of crowdfunding care. And I build on the work of Chris Barcelos in trans care. And I would recommend that all of you read Chris Barcelos's work on trans crowdfunding and the racial politics of crowdfunding. So he essentially argues that trans crowdfunding, although it's in some ways like a necessary ameliorative to the economic stratification of trans surgery, right? So it makes surgery affordable for some subjects. It helps defray the costs, the very high cost of surgery. It's also really only very effective for folks that are already well networked in terms of social media, that already live lives shaped by multiple forms of privilege, racial privilege, gender privilege, et cetera. So he documents statistically, right, like quantitatively, how it is that it's mostly white transmasculine folks that are able to raise significant funds through crowdfunding to defray the cost of surgery. And this happens also in the context of folks resharing crowdfunding calls from trans women of color, Black, Brown, and Indigenous trans women is a form of virtue signaling, but that doesn't actually translate into those campaigns raising substantial amounts of money in relationship to the money that white transmasculine people are able to raise. So that seems imperative to mention, just given the ubiquity of crowdfunding. I mean, I think if you are a trans person in this contemporary conjuncture, you see multiple requests for crowdfunding on social media every day. And, but we have very little space to talk about the political intricacies of those calls, even though they're ubiquitous and sort of like part of our everyday wallpaper. So I wanted to highlight that. And in relation to this bit about the sort of use of trans women of color as a form of virtue signaling, I think that we have this ongoing emphasis on basically trans women of color as a kind of necropolitical spectacle that is certain stories that are part of this necropolitical spectacular relationship with trans women of color are circulated as a means of like garnering sympathy for trans communities broadly, but they very rarely translate into actual material improvement in the conditions of the women that are at the center of these spectacles, if these women happen to be alive, right? And oftentimes part of the circulation of these stories is predicated on the fact that they are no longer alive. So that's, and then, yeah, the last little bit I'll say on this is because I've been living in sort of like rural or semi-rural areas in the Southeast and just, you know, Appalachia more broadly for the last many years of my life, I've been thinking a lot about race in relationship to rural-urban divides and how that informs trans care too. So I think I've been keen to think about stratification of medical access for trans subjects that attempts to build some kind of solidarity between rural predominantly white trans subjects and folks who are in metropolitan areas that have, for some folks, pretty readily accessible trans medical services. But those services, even if they're close in geographic proximity to some folks, remain radically inaccessible on account of cost, et cetera. So I would like to see more, I guess what I'm saying is I would like to see more transpolitical solidarity across urban rural divides that targets questions of stratification. And that's just a hope, I guess, in part because like I'm a little bit of a country boy. So there's that. And then for the third question, which had to do about questions of individualization versus collectivization, and specifically thinking about the individualization versus collectivization of care in relationship to COVID. Although I really want to thank the organizers for saying you can talk about COVID or not talk about COVID if you want to or don't want to. Because yeah, I think a lot of us are very sick of talking about it, or it's too triggering to talk about in this moment. I had initially, at the beginning of the pandemic, I had thought I'm going to plan this whole grad seminar that's about like queer and trans responses to the pandemic or to pandemics past, et cetera. And I'm so happy I didn't do that, because I don't think that I nor the graduate students that I work with have any bandwidth for having those conversations at this moment, right, a year into this. And sometimes it's important to not directly address these kinds of questions if you emotionally or energetically can't handle it. But that said, I will talk a little bit about COVID in relationship to some of what I've been thinking about. So something that's strange, people talk about like transition cohorts or classes, which I have always found charming. And there is something of like a COVID transition cohort. So I've been thinking a lot about what it means for people to transition in the context of a pandemic and in the context of the kind of isolation and withdrawal that we're all experiencing. And I've said, and I've heard a lot of other trans folks and friends talk about the fact that there's something about, if we have access to domestic spaces that are safe, that we can withdraw into, there's been something really like relieving about that, because we haven't had to deal with the same forms of intensive social surveillance that we normally have to. The same sort of awkward or violent social engagements or social interactions that so many trans folks just run into on a day-to-day basis. And there's been something nice about that withdrawal, actually, I think, for some of us. But I also think that at the beginning of the pandemic, right, I had multiple students, some students that I worked with, some students that I had just, heard about secondhand, who were having to go to domestic spaces that were just radically unsafe for them, where they weren't able to be out, where they were abused or punished, right, for being trans, for being queer. And there was no way for the university to deal with this. So there was I'm on like a commission it's like a presidential commission for LGBTQ equality at Penn State. And one of the conversations we had was like, do we have any funds to actually pay for housing for these students so we can bring them back to State College and make sure that they have a safe place to stay, even though the dorms are closed? And there weren't. And that was rough to think about. And it's in large part because, in relationship to queer and trans students who might be alienated from their bio families or their natal families, that's very hard to prove on paper, right? So it's very hard to disperse funds that actually might support them, even though those funds are all, the way that those funds are dispersed anyway is just a debt model that is terrible to begin with, but it's, you know, it'd be nice if some of these students had access to some funds to defray their cost of living that allowed them to be in a safe place, and they didn't. So yeah, that. And there was just this continued presumption that a return to home was like a reprieve from the institution of academia for students. And it was kind of like a vacation. And I think that this circulated pretty intensively at Penn State, which has a very, very white, very, very wealthy student base. And I just kept seeing the sort of repeated equation of home with care and safety that is just a total fallacy for so many trans subjects. And then really quick to wrap up, because I think I'm probably been talking for a while. Do you know, how many minutes has it been?
Yeah, wrapping up would be nice. Thank you. I mean, like
okay.
The whole day. I think we're reaching time. Thank you.
What was it?
I said I could listen to you for the whole day because I really enjoy what you have to say, but I think we're at time. So if you could wrap this for this section.
Yeah, that's fine. I'll just stop there. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for very rich elaborations already, and I hope that we have more time in the Q&A to come back to some of these threads that you've put out so nicely for us. So next, I would like to ask Shelly to share with us.
Thank you, Rika. And thank you, Pedro and Jocelyn and Amanda and all the invisible others that have put this together. Thank you for your remarks, Hill. I would love to talk to you more at some time today or at some other time about digitally mediated counterpublics, about rural-urban divides, and some of the other things you mentioned. So I'm excited, and I'm also excited to hear from Martin shortly. I wanted to quickly note that in addition to being here in Orlando and hence working and thinking and living on the tribal lands of the Miccosukee and Seminole peoples, that insofar as we're all gathered today on Zoom, right, that we are all working with a company that is headquartered on the territory of the Mukama Ohlone peoples. And there's all kinds of complicated things about what we're doing with technologies in terms of indigenous land rights here and elsewhere. So I have two strands of work, as Rika was suggesting, two trajectories. One is on queer kinship and more specifically queer motherhood. And more recently, I've been moving into thinking of what I have called technologies of care, especially smart home technologies, domestic technologies, social robotics, as ways in which we are now caring for ourselves. I hope I'll get to talk a little bit about the second, but I'll probably focus primarily on the first since our topic is queer kinship, and I haven't quite thought about the queerness of the technology angle as carefully as I might. I've been thinking more in terms of racial colonial dynamics. So in terms of the queer motherhood work that I've done, as Pedro suggested earlier, it sort of started from a conundrum about how could we even talk about queer motherhood, right? There's all these critiques in queer theory of breeders, and of heteronormative families and all of those things that we know well and are here in part to talk about today. And yet there's this form of mothering that I had entered that seemed to me to be getting decidedly queerer and queerer, not necessarily intentionally. it just started to unfold that way, right? My primary interest when I started thinking about it was around issues of adoption, which I'll come back to shortly, but later unfolded, in addition to open adoption, situations of separation, recouplings, myself, my former partner, and my children ended up with many, many mothers. Right? And so what I was working with was these questions that my children were raising around who their real mother was, right? Which sometimes centered biocentric narratives, sometimes centered social mothering narratives, and went back and forth, but this notion that there had to be one and only one real mother, right? So the place I was starting from was trying to figure out how to help them unlearn that, right? Because it was important to me that we had this complicated family arrangement where everybody was a real mother, not just me, and also not excluding me. So I think resolving the apparent paradox involved in queer mothering requires reclaiming mother from its traditional heteropatriarchal moorings on the one hand, while also reclaiming queer from what has sort of been a lineage in terms of, at least at the beginning and still to a large extent, sort of gay male theory, right? The stuff, I'm thinking here of Warner's stuff against narrativity, I'm thinking of Edelman's stuff about reproductive futurism and so forth, right? So I think there needs to be a sort of unmooring on both sides. And I think there's a variety of ways to think about it. Some of these include the ways I've thought about it. Some of it includes ways others have thought about it. I think what's been fundamental to most of the literature on queer mothering to date has been thinking about different ways in which sex and nature and motherhood get delinked in some way, shape, or fashion. And so I think we can think about that happening through queer procreation, right? So creating family through means other than heterosexuality, or perhaps other than sexuality altogether. Also queer procreation in terms of thinking about the capacity for gestation that does not come out of traditionally normative female bodies. We can also think in terms of queer parenting arrangements, which was part of what I had been thinking about, co-parenting relationships that are not necessarily or not only heterosexual. We can also think of resisting standards of maternal fitness. And here we can think more largely in terms of fitness as caregivers, not just mothers for our purposes today. So we can insist on the fitness of somebody to give care as a mother or otherwise, despite, for example, sexual desires that exceed the bounds of traditional heterosexual monogamy. We can also think of queer mothering in terms of a sort of inverting of the lines of inheritance. And I'm thinking here of Sarah Ahmed's work on lineages, for instance. One way to think about this is by placing children's subjectivities first, not in a self-sacrificial kind of way, but in terms of who's inheriting from who, right? So one way to be a queer mother is to care for and nurture intergenerationally queer kids. Right? So you sort of inherit your status as queerness from their status. If you're doing advocacy and you know, doing things differently, practicing mothering differently. And that's been my primary focus in thinking about queer mothering, has been different ways of doing family non-normatively. So that could include, for instance, challenging the sort of chrononormativity of traditional heterosexual families. And I'm thinking here in part of Halberstam's stuff around queer temporalities. Right, the family time, the times of wills and insurance and early to bed, early to rise, all of those kinds of things, but also just the chronotime of biological clocks and all of those narratives, right? Mothering that doesn't necessarily follow the first comes love, then comes marriage, then comes baby narrative, right? And also, in addition to sort of rubbing up against the chrononormative narratives, to push back against, resist in different ways or forms, domestonarrativity, right? So particular ways of living in households, right? So thinking here of the ways in which many families, in fact, live, which is not in your suburban house with your, 2 kids and a dog and the picket fence, as the trope goes, but families that are extended across cities, across states, across countries, across continents, and thinking of the different ways in which we do family apart, and figure out ways, some of them technologically mediated, and others not, of doing family non-normatively. And there's any number of ways of doing family non-normatively, right? To go back to Sarah Ahmed's work again, right? If we think of normativity as sort of that straight line, that straight lineage, there's innumerable ways to depart from that, right? Some depart further than others, but there's more practices of non-normativity than there are practices of normativity. So what we're dealing with is not actually a statistical norm, as we all know, right? But an idealized norm. So all of these ways of queering motherhood and others, if not redomesticated by the sort of assimilationist pull of homonormativity, have consequences, I think, that go beyond denaturalization too. So for example, when we uncouple parenthood from nature, it challenges the notion that our children are biological property, right? And gets us out of that sort of proprietary narrative. The denaturalizing of the maternal body can reveal conceptions of mothering as women's work as fundamentally flawed. Or, for example, attention to the wide diversity of sexual practices among mothers can help discredit the whole Madonna whore, good mother, bad mother dichotomy that continues to frame cultural and legal understandings of maternal fitness. So critical interrogations of this sort of good mother, bad mother dichotomy was part of what I was trying to work with in the book. And they're important not only for self-identified queers, but for all of those whose fitness as mothers has been questioned due to the sexual politics of race or class or ability or other kinds of marginalizing factors. So in these and a variety of other ways, I think that queer forms of mothering have the potential to radicalize practices and theories of motherhood. But whether or not that radical potential gets achieved, and this brings me to the second part of the question, right, really remains to be seen, because a lot of that radical potential continues to get undermined by the whiteness of queer maternal practices, which is to say that still, way past when this should be the case, right, the bulk of literature on queer mothering still focuses on homonormative lesbian families, as though that's what queer mothering means. So at the same time that there's been a challenge to the sort of good mother, bad mother dichotomy, there's been this sort of good queer, bad queer dichotomy that gets set up, right? And we saw this certainly in the US and Canada and probably other countries too, as the fight for legal state recognition of marriage and family making rights of lesbians and gays in this country got met with slippery slope arguments about, well, next thing you know, it'll be the polygamists, for instance, right? And notably, right, what the homonormative folks did was they said, oh, no, it won't be the polygamists next because they're bad, right? We don't support them, right? But we're just like you, okay? so you can accept us. And so there was a sort of rift that deepened between different types of queer communities. Then some of the poly folks got angry, and the polyamorous said, what are you doing, right? We're good people too. But the polyamorous still wanted to distinguish themselves from the polygamists, right? And there was both an urban-rural divide taking place there. If you paid any attention, as I have, to histories of FLDS communities, for instance, and raids that have taken away children and so forth from those communities. There's definitely a urban-rural, and there's clearly a racial divide as well, given that many of practicing polygamists are not necessarily FLDS, but are people from Muslim or other places where brown and black folks, non-Christian folks, right, are practicing family forms that for them are traditional, but don't read as normative in this particular part of the world. Sex workers, right, also sort of get left out of these homonormative narratives, as does anybody else that either doesn't have the desire or doesn't have the ability to be discreet about their queerness, right? One other thing I wanted to mention here about the neo-colonial tendencies of homonormative family making has to do with the ways in which it moves into thinking about family making as a sort of consumer choice, right? And here I think we need to be careful about not doing this families of choice over biofamilies as automatically better, because the chosen family narrative in the neoliberalism, in the era of neoliberalism, has really become a narrative about consumer choice. Right, so those who have the money to use various kinds of reproductive technologies, right, or to adopt internationally and so forth, have the ability to make these families. Right? Others don't necessarily have that ability. So it's the pocketbook, and this not only privileges the family making of some people over others, right? It actually depends on exploiting an often racialized and always class-based labor in terms of what some women are producing or reproducing for other women, right? So, we know the long histories.
Jump in here. Sorry, Shelly. I'm really enjoying I really hate this part of my job. We're already on time again. This is
okay. I'm sorry. So yeah, we'll wrap it up by just saying that I think I want to say this one thing, and we can talk about technology in the closing if we want, which is I don't think the problem in terms of the last question is the individualization of care quite as much as it is the privatization of care. I think the myth of the liberal individual here is the person who believes themselves to be self-sufficient, a giver of care, and that's too often just a person with money, right? Those with economic means are no less dependent on large, expansive communities of care that are doing the work and the labor that they need and want to do that care work. It's just that for them, it's invisible. They don't have to think about it. They erase it. But I think it's promiscuous for all of us.
Thank you so much.
Apologies for going over.
No, it's fine. Yeah, sorry. Please, Martin, would you share with us next?
Sure. I would like to begin by recognizing that I'm zooming from the land of the Ojibwe, Dakota, and Northern Cheyenne peoples. Next, I'd like to thank Rika and Pedro for inviting me and organizing this panel on a very relevant topic and to be in conversation with Hill and Shelly and with the audience. I'm going to go through the questions in one swoop, one hopefully under 15 minutes. So for years, my research on care has been connected to multiple phases of my personal life as a queer immigrant and the multiple phases of my professional endeavors. First, as an AIDS prevention education worker in 2 nonprofit organizations in New York City in the 90s, and secondly, as a scholar of queer anthropology. As an AIDS prevention education worker, I oversaw peer-led educational outreach to Asian immigrant cis female care workers, mostly maids and nannies in New York City, a majority of them from South Asia and the Philippines. It was here I started to become aware of the global reach of migrant care work, particularly, again, from my homeland, the Philippines. As a queer anthropologist, my focus has been on the various manifestations of care, primarily among queers of color in general, and Filipino queer immigrants in particular. In my early publications, I was interested in the problematic academic and popular gendering of discourses around the chain of care paradigm and the productive potentials of a queer critique. It was during this time that I was looking at popular cultural representations of Filipinos as, quote, a nation of maids, or, quote, a caring people, which were in fact bolstered by the mandatory training enforced by the Philippine government for any Filipino who wanted to work abroad, mostly in the service industries, as well as some impressions from various medias like movies, for instance, in other countries. Therefore, care, at least in the Philippines, became a celebrated national trait, and in the global north has become racialized and deprecatingly figured as brown and black and gendered cis female. Furthermore, my interest in care has focused on the counterintuitive, the uncomfortable tidal shifts and continued formations of relationality and sociality that accompany gestures, emotions, and sensorial regimes, as well as institutionalized practices that prop up what the mainstream world call care. So while my focus on care has not been explicitly connected to the idea of queer kinship, and as an anthropologist, kinship to me is a very triggering concept, and we'll talk about that later, and talk about my anxieties. I have always broadly framed care within the larger notions of the more capacious notions of togetherness and relationality. I've always been interested in the way care emerges out of forms of togetherness that are often incohesive and in fact messy. And by messy, I mean a generative form of disorder, blurred boundaries, and enmeshment that open up alternative queer optics of care. Through the queer optic of mess, care can be construed as consistently encumbered, never pure, and always alloyed with seemingly less heroic and oftentimes perceived as lacking the expected humanistic orientations of wholesome empathic altruism or the marks of effusive or legible caring performances. So my questions have been about how the contingencies of togetherness coexist with the messiness of care, particularly among minoritarian subjects, particularly immigrants of color. So allow me to give you very briefly, in that time that I have, calling from my book project entitled Queer Dwellings. From 2002 to 2012, I was involved in an ethnographic tracing and limning of the lives and interiors of a group of 6 unrelated, undocumented queer immigrants living in a cramped 1-bedroom apartment. And again, it's this kind of domestic scene, and I'm referring to what Shelly just said a few minutes ago. And they lived in a cramped apartment in the Jackson Heights neighborhood in the borough of Queens in New York City. The 6 people in this household, or the queer 6, as I affectionately call them, and by the way, this name is something that's turned out to be problematic and triggering for some people, and we can talk more about this naming later on. The queer 6 consisted of men and women from Ecuador, Colombia, India, and the Philippines, who variously and sometimes hesitantly identify as gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender. They came together with 2 pairs of friends, the Ecuadorian gay and lesbian, and the 2 South gay men, there's 2 pairs, via the efforts of Imelda, the trans Filipina, who casually knew them in the neighborhood. They pooled their resources together to come up with the rent and to pay the utilities bill, from their multiple service sector jobs. They often liken their one-bedroom apartment to a jungle, a wild, often rickety, messy formation of piles of clothes, boxes, suitcases, and other paraphernalia that form a dwelling, which I initially compared to a hoarder's lair. But after carefully examining through the years their precarious predicament, I then reconsidered my initial preconception of the household and begin to frame the so-called domestic mess or morass as a queer wild space of habitation that harbored entangled and meshed lives. The queer six were also rarely in the apartment at any one time. Usually 2 or 3 of them would be at work while others slept or did so-called domestic chores. No eating was allowed because of fear infestation. And the household members rarely socialized as a whole. And actually there was only one event that I can think of in the 10 years I engaged with them, when they were trapped during a winter storm in the apartment, and they shared food that they were supposed to bring to work or to other friends' houses. Now, while I described the accidental commensal event, this impromptu meal, in detail, and which I can't do so, but what I want to say is that this singular event did not lead to further what people expected as heroic solidarity or dramatically legible enactments of care and intimacy. In fact, as many of them would say in the years that followed, their days were spent with familiar strangers whose lives have gone on, running in wildly disparate trajectories and schedules. They went about their lives most of the time without actively seeking more intimate information about each other or enacting overt presentations of caring and togetherness. In other words, the commensal event led to the persistence of critical distancing and further cultivation of detached togetherness. I began to appreciate the various ways in which the queer six navigated the morass of their physical surroundings and their forced proximities by staying quiet because someone was always asleep in one corner, or by tempering or curtailing any emergent desire for another household member, or by comporting their bodies, modulating their voices, and synchronizing movements in what I term to be a kind of precarious quotidian choreography, or what Roland Barthes has called idiorhythmics, across a shared, circumscribed, limited space. I suggest that such movement illustrate a queer ethical form of togetherness and care that is particular to marginalized subjects or minoritarian subjects like the queer six. The queer six, as you know, both Hill and Shelly have noted, are the kinds of subjects that are marginalized, that are minoritarian, who nevertheless develop, according to Roland Barthes, a quote, a science or perhaps an art of distances. So the queer six would be characterized as together yet apart. Therefore, care in this case is not about fusion or an all-embracing intimacy, but rather about relative distancing or an incomplete, partial, if not fragile form of togetherness. I'm interested in the form of care that partakes of what I've called, in other works, disaffection, or a form of, again, this cultivated ethical distancing or a critical detachment. Detachment should not be immediately seen as or simplistically seen as a kind of embodied stance that evacuates or strongly removes any form of connection or sociality. In fact, it's not true, right? Detachment is always embedded in the social. Most researchers on care, labor, migration are unfortunately tied to this normative idea of care as always already legibly empathetic, proximal, and intimate. Some say that detachment, I've had this experience of someone in a conference paper I presented, that detachment can never be, and disaffection can never be part of care and care work, since these are antithetical. These scholars consider detachments as a form of emotional void, but then turning to feminists, scholars such as Arlie Hochschild, Joan Toronto, and more recently Maria Puig de la Bella Casa have pointed out before, care is a broad set of enactments that include stances, that are not easily readable as effusive caring. In her book, Matters of Care, Puig de la Bella Casa conducts a capacious mapping of care that goes that involves skillful navigation between emotional connection and a performative withholding of legible normative emotional displays. I suggest that distancing and detachments are vital forms of a queer of queer caring that enabled the queer six to survive. I always thought they would disband after a few months after I met them in 2002, but they stayed together for 10 years, and something needs to be said about that. I want to reaffirm what I argued at the beginning. The queer six dwell in a form of togetherness and care that is never unalloyed, but rather infused, if not funked up by seemingly contradictory interests, trajectories, and goals. Instead of an atopic, borderless site where blurry demarcations prevent a normative sense of togetherness and the formation of the individualized self-unit, the queer six in their apartment are in continuous struggle to recognize to recognize the constant building up and unraveling of lines between private and public spaces, which are always fragile and fleeting, oftentimes ending in failure. The queer six apartment offers a refuge that's not based on a bourgeois notion of a room of one's own, a particular kind of interior in its multiple physical and metaphorical level, but rather it's based on a shifting enactments of carrying this affection, of proximity and distance, of estrangement and intimacy. This is the core of what I'm trying to offer here. I submit that caring and togetherness are possible, albeit in alternative formations, insights of placelessness in minoritarian domiciles. So togetherness and care are not absolute, as I say again, but are imbued with mass tensions and contradictions, constituted by desires and interests. To conclude, I argue that it is through the queer six entangled and messy lives that we can find glimpses of alternative landscapes of togetherness and care, and to discover the resonances of their queer predicament. The last time I saw them was when they left the apartment in 2012, and I'd like to kind of bring it back to what with the morass that we as a world are living today. By queering care, I wanted to kind of say that subjects like the queer six fuel a sense of survival, a dwelling of the otherwise, a sense of being, building, and feeling that resonate at this present moment, when a pandemic requires quarantine, social distancing, and upending typical forms of sociality, when authoritarian regimes, ethnic decluttering, expulsions, and border controls, and popular cultural icons like Marie Kondo, and pathetic political creatures like the Orange One, entice and lure aspiring late liberal subjects into an ideology of ordered domestic bliss. In the midst of all these, the queer six, their crowded apartment, and their enmeshed lives offer a horizon of nourishing possibilities that might enable us to confront the snares and traps of late capitalist ethos, as well as, of course, what's happening now with the pandemic, and allow us to imagine queer, unconventional, yet valuable forms of togetherness and care. Finally, distancing and detachment have become the primary affective conditions of our present moment. On that note, I just wanted to briefly dwell on the uncanny character of our coming together today in this event. Here we all are from various time zones and geographical locations, gathering through the illusory intimacy. That's my timer. I'm almost done. Here we all are in the illusory intimacy of Zoom technology. Here we all are in the squared off forms of presences and absences that differentially expose and at the same time conceal various dimensions of ourselves, including states of dress or undress, fully dressed, I have to say, as well as states of grief and longing. Here we are after months of the pandemic quarantine, cultivating creative, ethical arts of distancing and detachment, and yet being here together, whatever and wherever that may be, because we're here, because in one way or the other, we believe we care about caring. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all of the speakers for their rich elaborations, and really you giving us much a lot to think about and think with. So maybe one more note on how we would like this Q&A to work. So we would like to for you to indicate in the chat that you have a question, or use your raise hand feature. And I hope that we can see that, because we have so many participants. But we would prefer for you to ask your own question if you feel comfortable. Otherwise, feel free to put your question in the chat. So if I'm not mistaken, we don't have questions yet. Is that right? Yeah. So while you're gathering maybe your thoughts, I'm gonna take the advantage and jump in first. And I also wanted to give the speakers the opportunity to respond to each other if you have anything burning. Maybe I should ask that first. No.
Right.
Oh, maybe. Okay, I'm sure that things will come up. So I'm gonna go first. And so one thing, and I'm very happy that Martin, you've also mentioned that now in your elaborations. One thing that I was struck with when preparing, especially for the event now, is sort of the question of denials of care, and the question of like living in a hostile, anti-queer, transphobic, racist, sexist world, and this figure of disaffection that you just mentioned, and then also comes up very strongly in Hill's work, where in Trans Care, he describes sort of being unable to listen to the chatter of the transphobic world, which I was very struck by, which I find very important. And then other work about breaks, negative effect, and so the disaffection as an effective force that makes survival and flourishing possible in a way. And so I guess maybe this is more common, but I would love for all of you to maybe elaborate more or converge with each other's work on this question of maybe to elaborate specifically about this connection between interdependence and relationality that obviously care ethics have emphasized as an ontological fact, but then at the same time, the fact that relations are not always benign and can be detrimental actually to survival and flourishing. And I'm not suggesting that care ethics or work on care generally does say that. That would be very straw many of me, but sort of I feel that it comes across particularly forceful in some of your work. So maybe you can elaborate on that tension and that important nuance and complexity that we have to understand in terms of that. Whoever wants to go first.
Just very quickly, I'll as an anthropologist who believe in the power of the ordinary and the minor and the infraordinary, as George Perec would say, what I really am involved in is what people would call the granular elements of building relationships and creating worlds. And to me, the idea that particularly minority subjects necessarily have to both create bridges to create these moments of intimacy, but also to in particular episodes to enact self-care in order to survive, right? So that it's never just an outward directionality, whatever outward means, that it could be, and it's quite important. And I think I see it in Hill's work, for instance, that what is necessary is for the subject, the minority subject, to care for themselves, right? In a way that I think is never is never emphasized. I think, I just wanted to just throw that out there.
Just quickly, in terms of self-care, I completely agree with you that it is important for minoritarian subjects to engage in self-care. I have also been a bit concerned about the ways in which that rhetoric of self-care has been taken up by sort of neoliberal, more privileged subjects, right? And it's just a myth that that it's just me by myself taking care of myself, because it isn't. I'm depending on the labor of so many others, right? When I order that thing from Amazon, which I try hard not to, or you know, every engagement I have to take care of myself is often enmeshed in exploiting the labor of other minoritarian subjects. Yeah.
I totally agree. I think, you know, I go back to the idea that the self is never the sovereign self, sovereign liberal self. So yes, I totally agree.
I just want to chime in really briefly and say, like, I am totally preoccupied with questions of detachment and disaffection. I'm so happy you talked about that, Martin. The book about being trans and feeling bad that I'm working on is actually organized around like 5 different negative affects or bad feelings. And all of them in some way, it's like rage, envy, fatigue, numbness, and burnout. And I argue that if there's anything that is something we might want to call like a trans affective commons, it's probably organized around those kinds of bad feelings, and not actually around any kind of like intimate togetherness, right? So totally preoccupied with this. And I also argue that all of those bad feelings are actually really integral to trans modes of what we might call self-care, although I, you know, share both of your concerns with the limitations of the discourse, right, of selfhood that operates there.
Right.
But yeah, detachment and disaffection are like crucial to moving through a really, really hostile world. And they're so under-discussed.
Thank you so much for all of your answers. We have a question from Eva Kite. I'm going to try and unmute you. If I can, or maybe you can unmute yourself. Oh no, now technological obstacles. Pedro, can you?
I'm trying.
Oh,
Try to do that.
I did something now.
It does look like she dropped the question in the
Okay, no, I have unmute. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. To the last point, I just wanted to remind people that Sarah Ruddock talked about mothering as a constant struggle against violence. So I think care theorists have always had that working, at least some care theorists have, that detachment, negative feelings, violence, these are always a part of the activity of care that one engages in. I'm interested in the last speaker, the question of the apartment of the 6, and the distancing and the care happening through the distancing at the same time as their togetherness. And this was fascinating, and I really thank you for that. But I want to ask, we can talk about all the incredible different ways in which caring takes place. And it's important to show all the different ways in which it takes place in minoritarian situations. But is this an answer to a non-ideal situation? Or is there an ideal embedded in here that you want to capture?
By ideal, you mean what? I'm not clear. An idealized situation, you mean?
I mean, well, we're all in non-ideal situations. So maybe that wasn't the best way to put it. But a particularly undesirable situation, you know, where people could not get a different kind of care that might better answer to their flourishing? Or is there an ideal or a notion of care that you're trying to pull out that is a completely, is a different one? Yeah. So we might have to respond to a certain situation with that kind of distance,
Right.
because of unfortunate circumstances we're in,
Mm-hmm.
and circumstances we do not want to be in, and circumstances that are that we're in because of unjust conditions. Okay, and yet we can still nourish ourselves in certain ways.
Right.
But so I'm asking, is that what you're pointing out to, or are you pointing out to a different ideal of care that is optimized, if you will,
Yeah,
by,
well,
do you understand what I'm saying?
I think so. I hope I'm going to answer it in the correct way. The way I see it, I think some people might think of the apartment as an extreme case of, you know, people, I don't live like that, right? But my use of this ethnographic site, if you will, of a cramped apartment that is basically uninhabitable. What I'm trying to say is two things. One is that yes, they make it habitable within the constraints that are presented to them, both emotional and physical. But I also think that the kind of, you know, through disaffection and distancing, but I also think that I'm pointing to the ways in which it's not, it's actually that the kinds of struggles they have are to varying degrees also something that people encounter in not so extreme circumstances. So people might have, you know, their spacious apartments, but it's necessary because, you know, whenever the last time I gave a talk in a care conference in Berlin, the first question was, I disagree that detachment has anything to do with care. That's my main thing. It's detachment is inherently part of care. You cannot, because you know what. So it's not about creating this kind of unique example of the queer six apartment. What I'm trying to say, and what you know, in that Berlin conference, where they were all scholars of care, and they just wouldn't accept my contention about care, detachment, distancing, and disaffection. I think if there's anything to be, you know, the takeaway from my abbreviated talk, it's that you know, that even going away from the queer six apartment into the, you know, the infraordinary events in people's lives, I think we need to recognize that care and distancing and detachment and disaffection are wedded together. They're not, you know, just unique emanations of an extreme situation or what you might call idealized.
Or non-idealized.
Or non-idealized, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. No, I think it's a very valid point, and I thank you for it.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have a couple of comments in the chat, and then we have a question by Lau. But before that, I think Jolie also had a question. Jolie, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll just like put my question out there, and then we can hear from the folks in the chat, other people. We can stack a few questions and see how much we can shoehorn into 5 minutes. But I was, first of all, such fantastic presentations, and really, this is, I feel like you all from different angles got right into a central question that we've been fussing over for a few years now in really provocative and generative ways. I guess to distill my question down to maybe the bones of it, I was really struck in both Hill's discussion and Shelly's that there's just a sense that if you're outside the lines in any way, you're on your own in terms of care. You're just, like there's no, sorry, I was like, that not only that you're going to be overtaxed in the case that Hill was talking about, because you will be responsible for everyone who is seen as being in your kind of community of care in any way, that because you're not supported. And I think that maybe this comes particularly from feminist scholars. There's a deep suspicion that there's a good state solution to this. But I think all of you have highlighted that there are problems with non-state solutions to this problem. And so I'm wondering where that leaves us in terms of where we turn. And so then I was really struck by Martin's, and I've seen pieces of this work in other settings, and I just love this project. But I would love to hear more from Martin about what happens. So that's the case, I think, the best to have of like a community of care that's not dependent upon one of these other functions. And so I'm wondering what happens in that community when somebody really falls into a deep need for care, and really does need the kind of time and attention and expertise and labor and all of the things that we think of as attending to care, in a context where there is an intentional, I'm right there with you in thinking that disaffection and detachment are critical aspects of care, I think, for most of us. But what happens when somebody actually requires perhaps more attachment than is available in that setting?
Maybe the other people might want to answer first. I don't know.
Or also, if there are other people who wanted to toss in questions and pile on and see what questions people actually want to take on.
Just very briefly, just to say, in the situation that you mentioned, I think there's a lot of times in the 10 years I've known them where they were needing, there's a lot of failure of the state, of so-called friends, of family back home. So there's a lot of failure that on the one hand, thinking about a queer sense of failure, it was a way to kind of maneuver, right? Not as a failure, not as a dead end, but a point of maneuvering. But but there were also times where I hate to say, that I'm a downer, but there are moments where you just have to say, yes, it failed, and people move on despite that, move on with the failure and despite the failure.
Thank you. Those are excellent thoughts for us. So I think we're nearing time rapidly. So I would love for Hill and Shelly to maybe jump in with maybe responding to some of the comments in the chat, or anything that I cut you off previously. So I would love for you to have the chance to share some more.
I feel moved just really quickly because there are folks that were in this summer school intensive that Arnazur and I taught that are here. And one of the conversations we had was actually about moments of care or attempted care that actually fail or feel bad or aren't reparative, even though the intent of the provider of such care is for them to be such. And I just feel like we haven't talked about that yet, but I wanted to put it on the table as something that I think is important to think with, because and I'm not just thinking about like benevolent or paternalistic modes of care that are harmful ultimately, but also so much well-intentioned giving of care is actually in excess of or not really responsive to the real needs or desires of the folks who are set up to receive it. So I'll stop there, but I wanted to mention.
And Shelly, are you still with us?
I am still here. I don't know that I have any final words of wisdom. I'm sitting here mulling over the phrase from Martin about fragility
Yeah,
of these
that's a good
caring
word.
relationships, and I'm thinking that that's a really important piece to think about, what it means to be fragile, how that fragility transpires, how it might help as well as hinder it. I mean, there's something important, and I think something queer about saying the relationship is fragile, and thus it can't be taken for granted. It's something that needs to be worked with, worked through. Yeah, recognition of mutual vulnerabilities of various kinds. Yeah.
And I think with that, we are at time. So apologies for the shortness of it all. I feel it should have gone much, much longer, but I want to thank all of the speakers for being so generous with their answers and sharing so richly with us today. And to all of you who attended. So maybe one last thing, it has been recorded. So the session has been recorded and it will be available via the GSF website. So
Rika, can I ask just one thing?
please.
There are the maybe questions that have been posted that have not been answered. Would it be possible for us just to respond to them in writing? Is that
Definitely.
possible?
So we're gonna share all the questions and comments with you, the speakers.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yes, so thank you so much. Jolie, did you want to have any last words? Maybe?
Just huge thanks. This is such a wonderful session, and I want to continue these conversations. So yeah, I hope that we have a chance to talk more. And thank you so much, Rika, for putting this together, because this was really
Rika. Bravo.